This event is part of our ongoing commitment to recognizing and uplifting the voices, stories, and lived experiences of the deaf and hard of hearing communities within literature, librarianship, and beyond. We're proud to host this important conversation today and are deeply grateful for the incredible lineup of speakers who bring with them a wealth of knowledge, creativity, and advocacy. More specifically, our keynote speaker, Evelyn Keolian, to our distinguished panelists, Alicia Deal, Mondo Vaden, KayCee Choi, MC Brickell, and Katie Albright. Each of you will help illuminate the vital importance of representation, equity, and access. At the iSchool, we believe that inclusivity is not just a value, it is a responsibility. Whether through research, storytelling, or technology, we're dedicated to fostering environments where every identity is heard, honored, and reflected. To access all of our previous Culture and Community Symposia for the past 4 years, please visit our Culture and Community website, our Deaf and History and Heritage website, and also our YouTube channel. I'm going to drop all of those in the chat after I introduce Evelyn. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to the wonderful insights, inspirations, and actions of our keynote and our panel, and looking forward to the conversation. Why don't we just take this moment for all of you to introduce yourselves while Evelyn gets squared away with her slides. So let me introduce Mondo first. Mondo, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hello. I'm Mondo. My surname is Mondo. I'm a librarian, like over here in Sacramento, California, and I'm very happy to be here. Like working with diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is one of my big focuses in my librarianship.
I'm trying to get out of this. How can I get out?
Get out of this?
Mm-hmm. To get, make it smaller.
Did you minimize it?
How do you minimize it?
Thank you, Mondo. Let me hand it over to KayCee. KayCee, you want to introduce yourself? Say hello.
Hello, I'm KayCee Choi. I'm a librarian over at Dallas Public Library, and I'm at a smallish branch called North Oak Cliff Library. I've been deaf for pretty much most of my life, and ASL was my first language, and English my second. Very happy to be here again this year.
Good to see you again, KayCee. I'm so sorry for mispronouncing your last name.
Of course.
Katie, Evelyn, what we're doing is we're just introducing the panelists so that you have time to get ready. Let me have a couple of other introductions, and then we'll turn it back over to you. So, Katie, would you like to say hello?
Forgot to unmute. Hi, everyone. My name is KayCee Albright, and I'm the Student Success Librarian at Otterbein University in Columbus, Ohio. I lost my hearing when I was 4 years old. We have a genetic hearing loss in my family that typically presents in childhood. I've been deaf probably since, I don't know, around the age of 20. So my hearing loss is progressive. But I've been interested in representation, inclusivity my whole life as a result of my hearing loss. And so that's what I work in my job.
Thank you, Katie. MC, you want to say hello?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is MC Brickell, and I just graduated with my MLIS last year, and I'm currently on the job hunt. We just moved to Chicago literally this Saturday, so I'm in a rental place, kind of getting my bearings about me right now. And so I lost my hearing at 8 months old when I had bacterial meningitis, and I had some language before then, but primarily British Sign Language actually ended up being my first language. we moved to Texas when I was 8, and I tried to pick up American Sign Language, but I was mainstreamed and didn't have much access to a deaf community around me, so I didn't really pick up as much of it as I'd like to, and it's been something that I've been trying to kind of make up for in the years since. And I got into librarianship because I didn't really see myself like anywhere else but the library, and after that, I just wanted to be in the library and be somewhere where other people with hearing loss and disabilities could see me and hopefully know that there was a place that they belonged as well.
Thank you, MC. Congratulations on your move to Chicago. Alicia, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Alicia Deal. I'm a former librarian with the Dallas Public Library. I was the former chair of ALA's Bridging Deaf Cultures Interest Group and a former chair for the Peggy Barber Tribute Grant Committee. I was also a co-founder and former president of the City of Dallas's Disabilities and Accessibilities Employee Resource Group. I basically am on a hiatus from librarianship. I moved back to my hometown to help take care of my aging parents, but I've been very much involved in disability advocacy and a volunteer with several disability-related organizations, including the U.S. Gender and Disability Justice Alliance and the Disability Empower Her Network. I'm also a current cohort member of the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities Advocacy Corps, which teaches those with disabilities how to advocate for oneself at the public policy level. And I also am volunteered to be a member of the American Psychological Association's Division 33, which is for those with autism and intellectual disabilities. They were asking for people who had autism to volunteer to help influence research on autism, and also volunteered for something called CARES, which is a community-oriented neurodiversity research operative, and they also provide research training. So I've been volunteering for a lot of stuff in the meantime. So
wonderful. It's good to meet you, Alicia. Thank you for all of that you do in the community. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our wonderful keynote, Evelyn Keolian. She is a children's librarian at Chicago Public Library. She is the founder and co-chair of CPL's Diversability Advocacy Committee. She's also an adjunct professor of American Sign Language at Oakton College. She received her MLIS from University of North Texas. We'll allow it. Born deaf, Evelyn has been an ASL user since adulthood. Previously, she has worked at the Pasadena City College Shadford Library in California, Renata Elementary School in California, and volunteered with Pasadena Public Library and the Annixter Center Literacy Program for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So please join me in welcoming Evelyn. We look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you very much.
So why I chose this topic. So growing up, I didn't really see any birds outside of Helen Keller. And then later on, when I was working at a elementary school with a deaf and hard of hearing program, there still weren't that many birds for the kids. And I remember the kids asking me, where are the birds that look like me? And then in my work as a librarian, when I've been creating booklets or blog posts, it's just really hard to find those books. For doing my booklets and blog posts, just reading even for pleasure. So I'm curious, how many deaf authors do you think we have? If you want to put it in the chat. Like, how many you think? So I had one person who said 20. More than 20. Any other guesses? So I have MC said 35. So a little bit closer. Another person said, oh, maybe that 100 when she was like, so no, not as many as 100. So I did like a Google search and like a little over 40. But when you think of other like Asian Americans or Latina authors or other people of color, or maybe even other disabilities, how many people do you think there are that are authors, writers? Like probably more like 100. Yeah. So I wasn't that surprised, but I still thought 40 was pretty good. I thought it was going to be less than 40. I knew it was going to be less than 100. So some historical background. Historically, deaf characters in literature were often portrayed as tragic figures, but were depicted as being silent or incomplete because they couldn't hear. So how does contemporary literature move away from these stereotypes? All the books where deaf characters are portrayed as complex, independent individuals. So this is the evaluation criteria that I came up with. I borrowed some of the criteria from the Schneider Family Book Award. For those of you that may be familiar or not familiar, this book award is for children and teen books that focuses on the disability experience. So the evaluation criteria that I came up with is with fiction, the title must feature a main or secondary character who is deaf, DeafBlind, or hard of hearing, must be portrayed accurately and authentically. Theme must be appropriate and respectful of the intended audience. With nonfiction, the title must be well-researched and well-written with an appeal to mainstream audiences. And then was it written by a deaf-blind, or hard of hearing person? If written by a hearing author, are they part of the deaf community? If not, is the information given about why they wrote the book? So I have divided up the presentation with, I'm going to cover adult titles, teen titles, and children's titles. So the first book I have is What is Visible by Kimberly Oakton, published in 2014. It's a historical fiction about Laura Bridgman, the first deaf-blind person who blazed a trail for Helen Keller. And there's only like there's not very many books about her, unfortunately. One of the things I love about this book is, even though it's historical fiction, the author interweaves quotes and relevant information at the beginning of each chapter about Laura's life and people who related to her. The Sign for Home by Blair Fell. So this is a romance with protagonist Arlo Dilly, a deaf-blind man. Now, this was written by a ASL interpreter who's also a writer for a couple of TV shows. This book I actually tried to get into, but I had a hard time getting into. What is visible is beautifully written. So both about the deaf-blind experience. And then we have True Biz by Sarah Novick, which was also, both Signed for a Home and True Biz were both published in 2022. So with True Biz, which is still doing really well, and a paperback version is coming out this year. So True Biz is set at the Fitchett River Valley School for the Deaf, which is in danger of being closed, as many residential deaf schools have been shutting down, unfortunately, due to lack of funds, lack of enrollment. So this includes Charlie, who is deaf, a transfer student, and new to the deaf community. Austin, who's basically the golden deaf boy. And then February, the hearing headmistress are the three protagonists. So this novel embraces ASL, deaf history, includes cochlear implant, oralism, and disability rights in this coming of age story. Okay, so plays and poetry. So I'm a huge theater geek. So I had to definitely include plays and poetry. So we have Children of a Lesser God by Mark Madoff. So he was a hearing playwright who wrote this for the deaf actor Philip Freelich, and it is partially based on her life. And was, as most people know, this was made into a movie. There's been countless productions of this play. Whispers of a Savage Short and other plays about the deaf American experience. So by Raymond Lusak. So this is a deaf writer and playwright. So these four plays are, the first one is called Snooty, which is a comedy. Love in My Veins, which takes place from 1978 to 2002. Dougal, which is Google with a D, and then the Whispers of a Savage Short. So these were written everything from like the mid-90s to the 2000s. And this book was published in 2009. And this author had written a total of 16 plays and other, but predominantly for the LGBTQ community and experience. He does have 2 new books that are coming out called The Language of Home, which is a collection of 30 stories that he's written over in nearly 40 years. So I'm looking forward to see that. And then he had another book that came out last year called I'll Tell You Later, Deaf Survivors of Dinner Table Syndrome. So that one, he edited. Then we have Try by Nina Rain, which was by a hearing British playwright. So it's basically about Billy, the lone deaf member in a hearing family. And the play is about finding yourself. And he also meets Sylvia, who who is slowly losing her hearing as well. And then we have the beautiful Deaf Republic by Alicia Deal, who is hard of hearing. And his poetry basically captures the history and devastation of war and, about being deaf and deaf culture. If you get a chance, if you look up, I believe it's in the New Yorker, there's an article and it's poetry in motion. So adult titles that are nonfiction. So we have Hearing Beethoven, a story of musical loss and discovery. I'm a huge fan of Beethoven. I grew up playing the piano. So when I found this book on him, I was just completely fascinated because most books on Beethoven do not really focus on his deafness. And this really explores that. The author, Robin Wallace, is hearing, but he's an expert on Beethoven's music. And then his wife, in her 40s, ended up losing her hearing personally. So he had that perspective. And it's wonderfully researched. Then we have Haven, the deaf blind woman who conquered Harvard Law, and this came out in 2018. Her memoir is unflinching, and it really shares how she learned to succeed despite barriers and learned how to advocate for herself. I loved this book. Even though I'm not that blind, I could relate to this book quite so well. Then we have Deaf Players in Major League Baseball, a history 1883 to present by R.A.R. Edwards. And he teaches courses on the history of baseball at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, which is also the home of the National Institute for the Deaf. So this book covers from William W. Hoy to Dick Sipek, critic pride of the Montreal Expo, just to name a few that were in this book, and it's very well researched. Then we have Deaf Utopia. I will admit that I did not jump on the Niall DeMarco bandwagon right away. It wasn't until I read his memoir that I became a fan of his. One thing I love about this book is that you not only get to know Niall, but you get to learn about deaf culture, deaf history. You hear all the different stories from his different family members. And then, he was involved, he won America's Next Top Model and was in Dancing with the Stars. So after I read his book, I went and watched those shows, which I never watched. I love that tie-in of being able to read his experience and then watching it actually happening. Then we have Touch the Future, which is a manifesto, an essay by John Lee Clark. And this is this is a deaf blind author. So he was born into a deaf family and he became blind by adolescence. His essays are so powerful and they cover being deaf blind, its history, and the emergence of the pro-tactile method. Now, when I was in grad school, I discovered the book through Deaf Eye when I was at Shelby at the community college. Through Deaf Eye, it's a photographic history of an American community by Boynton, Gannon, and Bergeron. So there's also a documentary. I'm just going to share a few pictures. So in picture one, it's a black and white group picture, and it's at the Kentucky School for the Deaf in 1865. Then picture two, a group of alumni from Kentucky School for the Deaf who worked for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. And then the third picture was a Deaf Literary Society taken in 1888. So I remember when I saw that, I was like, wow, I have to have an ASL book club, which I did have for a while. We actually read True Biz and Deaf Utopia when I was in that book club. And these pictures are what they cover the Deaf president now. And ironically, Niall DeMarco was here in Chicago over the weekend promoting his documentary, Deaf President Now. So for those that may not be familiar with what Deaf President Now, it wasn't until 1988 that Gallaudet, a Deaf university, finally got its first Deaf president. In the past, they had always been hearing presidents, and often hearing presidents that even know ASL. So this was a big deal. So recently published titled, But You Look So Normal, Lost and Found in a Hearing World by Claudia Marcel. So this is a memoir of a deaf Jewish artist who became a photographer and painter. We have The Deaf Girl by Abigail Herringer. You may recognize her from The Bachelor. She was born profoundly deaf, and she is a CI user. Her older sister is also deaf. And as the title says, it's a memoir of hearing loss, hope, and fighting against the odds. Then we have I Felt the Cheer, The Remarkable Silent Life of Curtis Pride, which was also co-written with Doug Ward, and that just came out this year. So he became the MLB deaf player, the first deaf player to Dick Sipak in 1945. So he became the first deaf player in 1993. So you had that whole gap from 1945 to 1993 with no deaf players in baseball. That's pretty amazing. So he played 11 seasons with 6 teams. And then we had the Boys of Riverside, a deaf football team and a quest for glory by Thomas Fuller, who is a journalist for the New York Times based in San Francisco area. This is very promising. I did not get a chance to read it, but it's very promising. The author commuted back and forth during their season and lived with a deaf family when he was staying in Riverside. There's photos in the book. So I would say definitely to pick up The Boys of Riverside. And a couple more recently published adult titles. So we have A Sign of Her Own by Sarah Marsh, who is the deaf author. So this is a historical fiction that follows a former deaf student of Alexander Graham Bell. Inspired by AGB's real deaf student, this debut cast a new light on the inventor and the invention that changed how we communicate. And then we have In This Sign. So this was originally published in 1970. So it's a brand new reprint by Penguin Classic. And the introduction is by none other than Sarah Novak, who wrote True Red. So this classic still perfectly portrays the nuances of deaf culture. And what was interesting was in Sarah's introduction, she said that the author's husband was a Department of Rehabilitation counselor for deaf and hard of hearing folks. And also Joanne Greenberg, you may know her. Also, she wrote I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. And Own Voices mental illness. Someone who lives with mental illness. So for a teen title, I only have 4 titles. Unfortunately, in the teen genre, it is so hard to find, but I could have gone further back, but I was really trying to stay within like 10 years, because especially for teen titles, anything older than 5 years is considered outdated for teen. So I decided to just highlight the most recent one that I found. So we have The Silence Between Us by Alison Gervais. So she is deaf. What was interesting about this book is the family science, but there's no note from the author explaining that this is not the norm. So while I enjoyed this book, I was disappointed by that. And that might seem like a small thing, but I feel like most people don't realize that the majority of deaf children come from hearing family, not from deaf family. The Word in My Hand by Asphyxia. One thing about this, even though it won a Snyder honor, is by an Australian author. And I have found that oftentimes American deaf culture is not necessarily the same as other deaf cultures in other countries. So I think that's something that people may not realize who are not deaf. And that's the interesting thing about the Snyder Family Book Award. They will accept any book to be considered as long as it's written in English. So it doesn't matter if it's been written by a non-American author. And then we have Give Me a Sign and On the Bright Side by Anna Sortino. So interesting that she lives outside of Chicago, and she is deaf herself. So in Give Me a Sign, it's a hard of hearing girl who uses hearing aids. And then On the Bright Side, we have a deaf girl. Ellie, and she's had to move back home because her residential school had to close. The cool thing about this book, Anna Sortino, also includes a love interest, Jackson, who has MS, and it's out of life from her author's note that maybe she is experiencing MS herself. And then now we're into children's books. So I love children's books, but I'm a children's librarian. So the visual I have here, children titled by Karen Kane. So she is, I'm not sure she currently is, but I know in the past for sure she's been an ASL interpreter. And she first came out with Charlie and Frog, a mystery series. And Frog is the secondary character who is a deaf girl. Unfortunately, this series was a miss. It was very hard to read. And I remember meeting the author. She had asked me if I had heard of the series. And I said, yes, I did. And I said, me and my colleague, we tried to read the book, but we couldn't get through them. We can't get through them as adults, and a child is going to have trouble reading them. So I was actually thrilled when I saw Monster Hand, which came out last year, and it got an honor from Snyder. And I'm going to show a little bit of what I love about that. So the great thing about this book is she actually paired up with a deaf author and illustrator. So I love in the illustration how you can see how expressive the two deaf kids are, Milo and Mel. The signs are well illustrated. So here it says, I'm scared, sign Milo, and the sign scared is like perfectly illustrated. And then when Mel says why, the illustrations are like perfect. You can clearly see the sign. And that's not always the case with children's picture books. And here we have, is the monster gone? And I can clearly see, her sign gone. And then Milo's, like, say, hungry, and clearly can see that. And here's like another example of how expressive they are. And then here we see them making the monster hand. And then also when they're both saying, are you ready? I love how you can see the movement of the signing in the book. And then here it's just like the full page. You see them like roaring at the monster. And I'm going to go into a little bit more about ASL uses in picture book. But I'm going to pivot to children titled with deaf historical fiction with deaf author Anne Claire Lisa. So we have Show Me a Sign, Set Me Free, and Sail Me Away Home. And these are set in the early 1800s on a small town, Showmark, on Martha's Vineyard. So you can follow Mary Lambert's journey in this historical trilogy. So the third book is set in Paris, where she travels to meet and work with John Mansfield and Lauren Clark, who were instrumental in the development of ASL. I love this trilogy. Even though Set Me Free isn't as strong, all three but together are just absolutely wonderful if you want to learn more about deaf history. And then Dear Run Home is sad, very tragic, but it's based on a true story about a woman who ended up adopting a deaf girl. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time. So more middle grade, but we have El Defo by Cece Bell, who another Own Voices, and I was showing another Own Voices author, illustrator, and we'll be showing them pages of her book after this slide. We have Song for a Whale by Lynn Kelly. Lynn Kelly was a special ed teacher and ASL interpreter. And this is about 12-year-old Iris and her grandparents are all deaf, even though her parents are hearing. And then we have Alec Gino, You Don't Know Everything, Jilly P. So you have two deaf characters. We have Jilly, who is a white girl, but then I love that you have Derek, who is a Black boy. So finally some more diversity in literature. And then we have Make a Little Way, which is Savannah, who's an 8th grader who wears a cochlear implant. And it's about how she moved to a new home in a new city. So she's adjusting, a new hearing school, a new home. And here, I love El Defo. I will never forget the first time I read it. I cried because I really related to a lot of the experiences that Cece Bell experienced. While I never wore a phonic ear, I had like the little hearing aid with the little box with the wires, So I can't tell you how many hearing tests I've had and how many audiograms I've seen. But if you haven't picked up El Defo, I would say don't walk, run. And this book basically takes you through her journey as when she starts school, when she ends up having to move. And so this one is from her more recently published one. It's a super powered version, which I recommend because you also get to see more of her writing and illustrating process, photos from when she was a child. And then some picture books. I love the Moses series by Isaac Millman. This came out in the early 2000s. I know it's much older, but again, so often I'm so disappointed by the new picture books that come out. I would love to see an updated version of something similar to this series. So there's 4 books in this series. We have Moses sees a play, Moses goes to school, goes to a concert, and also goes to the circus. Then we have My Heart Glow, Alec Coswell, Thomas Gallaudet, and The Birth of American Sign Language, which is an historical fiction book. we have Can Bear Ski by Raymond Antrobot and Polly Dunbar. So Raymond is deaf and Polly is partially deaf, so both own voices. And this was written based on his childhood experience, finding out he is hard of hearing and needs hearing aids. I love the Can Bear. It's so cute, and kids can relate to it. And I think it's great for kids that may have a classmate or friend who's deaf or hard of hearing to learn more about that experience. So a little bit about the use of sign language and book. I recognize that this is not an easy thing to do, but it's so important to get it right. So Butterfly on the Wind by Adam Pottle, illustrated by Zhu Chen. So they both are deaf, but Chen is from Singapore. So I'm guessing that their signs are not that similar to ASL. This was a cute book and story, but some of the signs were not illustrated clearly or correctly, unfortunately. So Cecilia feels the beat. So this was written by Denise Rosario Adersi, and she had a cousin who is deaf that she grew up with. So that's what inspired her to write this book. And it was illustrated by Priscilla Soares, who is a deaf artist. So the story itself is beautiful, but I wanted to just show that some of the illustration, even though here it says that she signed perfect, it doesn't look like perfect to me. It looks more like maybe meat, but not perfect. And then here she's supposed to be signing shoe, and it kind of looks like shoe, but again, I feel like her hands are not as clear as what you see in Monster's hand. And then here, she's supposed to be signing no, but again, it looks pretty close, but I feel like it could be clearer. And then here, she's supposed to be signing feel. And when I tried to imitate what she was doing, I'm like, no, that's not the hand position. Her hand would be to sign feel. It just, like, that just hurts my hand. Like, it should be more, like, sideways. And then here we have thank you. Here, beautifully illustrated. And then I also had Dancing Hands, which is a story of friendship in Filipino sign language by Joanna Q and Chirino Marquez. So here we had a hearing author who was with a deaf author, and then it was originally published in Tagalog, and then it was translated into English. So pretty much like right on time. So here's my contact information. Evelyn at Keolian@gmail.com, or you can reach me at my work, Keolian at CHIPUBLIBD.org. And then I have a blog on the library website. So let me stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Let's give Evelyn a loud round of applause. That was wonderful and inspiring.
Yeah, thank you again for being patient with me for figuring out the technology.
No worries. Technology is always a double-edged sword. We've been doing this for so long. Yeah, whatever. All right. Well, so Evelyn has also been generous enough to moderate our next panel. And the good news, Evelyn, is that while we're working on the tech issues, the entire panel has introduced themselves. And so I think I'd like to turn it over to you, and they all have introduced themselves. So feel free to continue. Thank you so much.
Okay. I list that. Do you want me to deal with questions now, or should I go straight to the panelist?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Deal with questions first. Absolutely.
Okay, so it said, in your opinion, as a scholar and reader, how many authors writing about deaf experience, let's say out of 5 authors are hearing, how many of the deaf authors are published in fiction versus nonfiction, and why do you think that is? And then how can we, as a field, demand authentic representation? I think in general, I feel like there's probably more hearing writing, but I think that goes back to, I don't know if the percentage had changed or not, but I remember when I first thought about becoming a teacher for the deaf in the high school setting, and thinking that I'm going to be able to teach them Shakespeare, because that's what I learned when I went to high school, but I was mainstreamed as the only deaf kid, and being told, no, that's not going to happen. Because they told me most kids graduated from high school, most deaf kids, with a 3rd to 5th grade reading level. So if that's still the case for many deaf kids, how many of them are going to grow up to become writers? And if their first language is not English, but ASL, then why are they going to be motivated to write? Like for me, my first language was the written word, because my mom used these flashcards that she made. She would have like the picture and the word. So for me, my window into the world was always the written word. Not what I heard, but what I read. So if you left anything like laying around, I would be sure to read it. Everything I read, that's how I get my information. I think that's why, just in general, but I feel that we're getting more and more deaf writers as time goes on, and hopefully we'll get more. I think also, I know for me, I'm a writer, and for me, writing programs are not accessible for me. Even writing conferences are not accessible for me. So I think there's just so many layers as how can we as a field demand authentic representation. So if deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind people can't find accessibility to get trained or learn the craft of writing, how are you gonna develop those writers? So that's something. So what can San Jose State University do? I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with it also pushing the publisher that we need more diverse voices, especially deaf voices. So I think we could go ahead and let Mondo finish the introduction. And then we can go to the question.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Like you hit so many books that I was like, yes, this one and that one and that one. And I loved all of them. But yes, I'm Mondo Vaden. I'm deaf, black, and trans. I was a little thrown off because Dr. Chow referred to me as a her, and I'm definitely not a her. My pronouns are he and they. I'm a librarian. I'm a researcher. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion accessibility consultant, and I'm also a drag king as well, providing deaf queer representation to the greater queer and hearing communities as well. And part of why I was happy to be here today was because I myself am a published author, and being able to contribute to this conversation feels very full circle to me as well. And thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that, finishing up your introduction, Mondo. So I don't know who wants to start, but answering the panel question. So I'm going to start with, I have 5 questions for the panelists. So the first one is, what's your favorite title with a focus on deaf representation and why? It can be fiction, nonfiction, a play or poetry, and so forth.
I guess I'll go first. So you already shared it, but my absolute favorite is El Defo by CC Bell. I read that for the first time when I was 31, and that was the first time that I felt seen and represented in what I was reading. There's a bit early on where she talks about laughing when everybody around her is laughing, even though she doesn't know what they're saying. And it was just like that moment made me cry because that's what I've been doing my whole life. And I've never seen something like that up until that point, that shared that kind of experience. And it was shared in such a way that I think people who aren't deaf could understand some of what deaf people feel. So yeah, that one just blew me away when I read it. And even though I've read other fiction since, or other titles since, that one's my favorite.
I have to say I agree with that, Katie, because also I read El Defo when I was an adult. Most of my deaf literature writing experience has been hearing people writing about deaf people or for tokenism or plot device, a person would be deaf. And it was always weird to me because I felt like kind of like as a deaf person, I was in a National Geographic episode and hearing people are like, and here we are in the wilds of the deaf world. Here's how not to scare them, kind of feeling. And so that's the only time I ever saw myself represented. The first time that I saw it in a literary standpoint, the gosh, I forgot the title. The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, I think. And this young lady who was maybe 20 wrote this novel. It's a very good novel. I enjoyed it. But she's a young lady and she's hearing with no deaf experience that I could find, writes about two deaf mute characters who are men. And I thought that was very strange. I also thought that S.E. Hinton writing about teenage boys and gangs was weird also. The big thing for me about deaf literacy is becoming literate in the first place, because ASL is my first language and English is my second, and the written word English is my second language. Lip reading English, I guess you could say, is my third language because the two are not together. And it was like learning how to speak in Spanish, but then having to learn how to write in French, never hearing French or experiencing French. And so that's why English is so hard to learn as a language. And I think is one of the barriers as to why in the past there hasn't been visibly a lot of deaf representation in literature.
Anyone else?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Alicia, go.
Okay. So I realized I did not explain exactly what my experiences are as a deaf, hard of hearing person. But when I was about in junior high, 6th or 7th grade, that was when I was diagnosed with hearing loss. And I was continuing to be mainstreamed, and they really did not do anything to accommodate me. There was no IEP evaluation or any kind of anything done to determine how I could be accommodated. And then never exposed to ASL or the deaf community or anything. And it was only until recently that I found a deaf teacher who could teach me ASL, because that was also a barrier with, learning ASL is I want to learn from a deaf teacher and someone within the community. It's only recently that I took those ASL classes, but I need to practice more. But anyway, so because of the age at which I was diagnosed with hearing loss, I gravitated toward the children's books when I first started reading about deaf literature, because I did not know it even existed at all. And it's only until recently when I started working for the Dallas Public Library that I discovered that there's several deaf authors and books available. And so that series happens to be, which Evelyn discussed it, but I have the actual books by Anne Claire Lazat. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly, but those are the books that I read first. And the first one was actually T4. And it talks about the NOXI targeting of disabled people back before World War II, and it focuses on a young girl who was about roughly the same age as I was when I was diagnosed with my hearing loss. Same thing with the character in the other series, Show Me a Sign. And so because of that, I gravitated toward those books, and I just felt seen in those books, and really wished that they had this available at the time that I learned about my diagnosis, and it would have given me more confidence in everything. But that's why I gravitated toward those books. And you also learn a whole lot about deaf history that I never knew about. And so for me, that was really, it really affected me emotionally reading these books, just because like this is the first time seeing myself as that child, learning about, I have hearing loss, learning about that, and then reading that these, there is representation in these characters. And so so that happens to be one of my favorite series. I have many other favorite books, but that one was the one that just immediately came to mind. So.
For myself, I really appreciated this question specifically because for myself, I actually don't consider, like in terms of languages, I consider written language written English to be my first language, because I started reading before I was speaking, before I was signing, and then I began to learn spoken English due to being mainstreamed. And then I didn't start learning sign language until I was 11 years old. But my first experiences with the deaf community were via books, starting with Deaf Like Me, which is a book that details the experience of hearing parents who discovered that their child is deaf and their journey through learning how to navigate raising a deaf child. I was given this book by my mother, who is a hearing woman, and she intended her best, but she didn't necessarily understand the optics of this, where my first experience with deaf culture was understanding parental experience around deafness. And like ultimately that book goes through a lot of twists and turns, but ultimately they came to the conclusion that they needed to teach their child sign language. And that was like a really important lesson in there. But in terms of and then later I discovered The Male Coworker. This is actually my ancient copy from the 60s, where they still refer to the servant boy in this book as a Negro. And that gave me a little bit of a skewed perspective around my own role as a Black deaf person in this book that's so considered so fundamental to a lot of people's understanding of deaf-blind experience. And then that brings me to the book that I then read after that. And just note, all of these books are not my favorites. These books are just the books that contributed to my experience as a deaf adult now. I had read this book called Rebuilt, which basically talks about a hearing man who loses his hearing. He becomes deaf. He gets a cochlear implant. And then he starts to begin experiencing hearing again and finding out that it's very skewed. And that was something that for myself, it allowed me to understand a little bit more about how cochlears are interpreted and experienced by people in day to day. And that's how I realized that a lot of people who they start off most of their life hearing and then they lose their hearing, and they really do feel deeply that this is a loss. They really do feel this is a hearing loss. And so those three books were deeply fundamental to my understanding of how skewed deaf experience can be represented. And so then, my favorite, finally, the important things, this book called Continuum by Shalaman, he's deaf, trans, non-binary, he's Jewish and Chinese. And he talks a lot about their experience. And that was something that I had never seen. I'd never seen someone experiencing POC experience with non-binary trans experience along with deafness. And this book, Chalaman undergoes, their experience through navigating their hearing disability, but it also includes them coming out. It talks about them finding love with a partner who is hearing but is learning sign language. So this was my favorite, as well as one that I don't physically have called Mooncakes. And Mooncakes is by Suzanne Walker, and that book features a deaf witch. And this is a teen graphic novel. It's a deaf witch and her relationship, her friendship with a genderqueer werewolf. It's a long story. You have to read it yourself to get the details. But I did appreciate that they had a lot of indication around being inclusive of deafness and being inclusive like queer experience as well. And last but not least, Raymond Luskak, who was mentioned earlier in the presentation, he came out with a series of books on queer experience, but specifically the one that I found to be my favorite was Eyes of Desire, which is a LGBT-like anthology of deaf experience and specifically of deaf queer experience. And that gave me so much grounding and food for thought to understand that deaf queer people exist and we're here. So those were my big three ones, and compared to the ones that contributed honestly a little negatively to my overall experience.
I just want to say, I feel like I'm almost repeating other titles, and that makes me so excited because a lot of the times in book conversations, it's like, oh, I'm the only one that's heard of this book. And so to hear everybody else sharing similar titles, I'm like, oh, okay, good. Now everybody else can hear this book. But I would like to say, I think the first book that I read with a deaf main character would have been Deaf Child Crossing by Marlee Matlin. I can't remember exactly when it came out. I was in elementary school, so probably would have been like the 2000s. And it was the first book that I read with a deaf main character. And I was just like, wow, this is actually like everything that I've experienced in my life that I haven't read in a book before. And that blew my mind at just like 10, 11 years old, that there was fiction that actually was about my life. Yeah, and so I think most recently, probably my favorite piece of deaf fiction, well, deaf nonfiction would be Raymond Antrobus, who Ken Bearski was mentioned, but he also writes a lot of poetry. And so I'm going to link one of my favorite poems by his, which is called Dear Hearing World. And I really like Raymond Antrobus's poetry because when I read it, I was like, oh, so, he's not only being like a nice deaf person, he's got like anger. He's not happy about the way that deaf people are treated, which is incredibly fair and valid. I think sometimes in children's literature and learning about deaf cultures, you sometimes get this very nice disabled character who's just doing their best to fit in and make sense of the world, which is a totally valid viewpoint. But I was kind of an angry kid a lot of the time. And so to kind of show up later and see that anger and resentment and just not being able to understand the world around me, it's just really, it's just really affirming to have that shown back to me later on in life.
So I think everybody got a chance to answer that first question. So thank you for all of your very thoughtful responses. And I said in the chat, it was impossible for me to include all the questions. I realized, oh, you only have so much time. Yeah. And I kept finding another book. I'm like, you're done. So too, how can deaf representation in literature affect the reading experience for deaf and hearing readers? So I feel like I've heard a lot about how it affects you personally. So maybe focus on the hearing reader more for this question, but you can include both.
I think for any diversity, enlightenment, dare I say wokeness, when you read about diversity, you become more accepting, understanding, compassionate, all of those things. And so having Asian characters or African American characters, immigrants in in literature that you read for fun anyways can only add to your worldview of like when you encounter someone who is deaf or deafblind or in a wheelchair, you don't freak out or go like, oh, this I read a whole nonfiction book about you, and now I know about you and your people. That it becomes more of a okay, one more fun person to add to the mix kind of thing.
I'll go next. So I want to preface this by saying that when I was in elementary school, we were still in the card catalog days. And so it was very difficult for me as a kid to find books that featured deaf or hard of hearing characters. So when I was little, the only series that I knew, or the only books, were the Flying Fingers Club, which is a series of, I think, 5 books about it's a little boy with a learning disability who becomes friends with a deaf boy. And so he learns sign language, and it sort of follows their adventures. But as an adult looking back, it's not necessarily something that I would want hearing people to learn from. I didn't feel like it was the best representation necessarily of the deaf community. So I think as we get closer to where we are now, we're starting to see more authentic representation. We're starting to see own voices write fiction. And I think we're going from a place where deaf and hard of hearing characters were typically side characters. They were there so that the main character could learn and grow as a person, but it wasn't centered around the deaf experience. And I think we're getting to the point today where that's starting to change, and we're starting to see deaf or hard of hearing people as the main characters. And I think that makes it so much easier for hearing people to read them and be able to understand from our points of view what life is like for us, all the things that we experience that they just don't think of because it's outside of their lived experience.
I think deaf representation in literature also is important because, again, it builds empathy, but it's also equally important for hearing people to have deaf people around them in their lives. And I don't mean that as a sense of like deaf people have to help hearing people understand them. I think, again, it just comes back to building empathy and diversity and inclusivity. And you can't understand the deaf experience by reading one deaf book. You can't understand the deaf experience by knowing one deaf person. You have to keep going and immerse yourself not only in literature, but in the community as well.
Like for myself, I felt that in regards to making that representation, like positively, in fact, affects like deaf and hearing readers, like a lot of other people already said what I pretty much also agree with strongly, which is the concept of having accurate representation and having more of us speak for ourselves. Like, for example, there's a lot of books by coders, there's a lot of books by interpreters, but I find that those books tend to go more mainstream, like they reach more people than the books that are literally written by authors of deaf experience. And I always am very curious about like the barriers that are keeping us from being able to have more of our own voices out there. Like how are we supposed to get into a publisher office if we can't even make the phone call in order to advocate for, hey, this is why you should publish our book? Like wondering if we're like, oh, well, are there other people who are living this experience? And because like for me, I don't believe that the representation should be done for hearing people. I believe the I believe that the representation should be done for deaf community. Hearing people, they already have a lot of books to represent their own experience. And I think by centering deaf voices, that allows us to actually support the deaf community and support the deaf reading experience. Because I know, I think Sarah Novick had talked about the concept of her books being turned into audiobooks, that she would not be able to personally engage with. You know, she can't necessarily go back and say like, yes, this is the correct voice. This is how I wanted the story to be told. And it's something that where it's very interesting to me because stuff like that is really an accommodation for people who can hear. When so many of us who are living deaf experience, we don't have a lot of accommodation for the fact that we cannot hear, you know, like books are like literally one of the few aspects of media that are genuinely inclusive. Generally inclusive, not always. And yes, it's absolutely an accommodation for people who can see, but it's still for people who can hear. It's still a hearing experience that they are living, where they are still navigating audio. And so that's not necessarily something that would be accessible to deafblind people, for instance. Like deafblind people cannot necessarily engage with audiobooks in the same way. And so on and so forth. Like, so while audiobooks are very much an accommodation for many people, they are not necessarily an accommodation for the deaf community. And that is something that I think a lot of people are still kind of figuring out. I've had people recommend books to me and they were like, oh, you should really check out the audiobook. The author did this, the author did that. And I was like, do you understand that being deaf means that my ears do not work? I can't just check out the audiobook because the textbook is not available. And so that means that I'm not able to necessarily engage with a lot of, like, say, author readings, for instance. And that impacts my experience in terms of engaging with books, even by hearing authors, because the concept of, hey, deaf people enjoy books is very much an afterthought. They assume that we don't read. They assume that for some reason, like I continually find people who are surprised to find that I'm deaf and a librarian because they're like, oh, like that never occurred to me that that could be a thing, even though obviously it is, looking at all of our lovely faces on here. And so like I realized that we definitely need more of these like specialized libraries. Like in San Francisco, they have a deaf services library on the bottom floor in San Francisco Public Library. And it's staffed by deaf librarians. And that was the first time I ever ran into deaf librarians and be able to talk about these representation issues and talk about how we can create more of these things. And so I think the deaf representation, it affects hearing people by potentially giving them a skewed perspective when you consider that the books that are more likely to be mainstream are the ones written by hearing people. And like even people like Niall DeMarco, like, you know, we are able to have this show. He has a book out, you know, he's known for being beautiful and being on America's Next Top Model. Like, and he's like done all of these different things. But I still, every day, I run into people being like, who's Niall DeMarco? Why is he important? And I would say he's probably one of the most visible people. And he's written a book, and so many people don't even know he's written a book. They're more focused on like, oh, he did the show, and he was on America's Next Top Model because they see him in this visual role. And where, to an extent, I feel like a lot of hearing people view his work as inspiration porn, specifically, because, you know, he's put a very pretty face on the deaf community. No shade, no shade. He's very handsome, and I love that for him. But I do feel that when people are engaging with deaf representation, if it has not been hit through the lens of deaf authors and deaf writers, then the hearing audience is always going to get a misperception. And that's something that I'm much more interested in challenging, because representation isn't everything. Like, this book being published does not automatically mean that people are going to be reading it. And so that's something that I think a lot about, just like the experience of the reading is something that we don't get to experience because those books are not being pushed.
Basically, I just agree with what everyone has said. But like, again, as a child being diagnosed with hearing loss and stuff, not only did it affect me, but also my family. And that's one of the things that I realized, now that I've discovered this deaf literature, reading it and then comparing it to those who are hearing, who have written about the deaf experience. And I feel that for like families, they really need to read materials not from the hearing people about how their loved one is such a burden, or all of the self-pity that a lot of these authors have about having to care for or interact with a deaf family member, but actually reading what it's like from the deaf perspective, so they can truly understand what it is like for me as a deaf, hard of hearing person, because I do not understand that. And it's still challenging, even though I've been deaf and hard of hearing, since I was a child. It's still challenging to get my own family to accommodate me and to understand why I need accommodation. And again, those books by hearing people, the codas, and things like that, is not going to really explain it in a way to get, our families to understand what it's like for us. Because again, like I said, a lot of those books are just about pity, about I feel sorry that they are going through this. I feel sorry for myself for trying to accommodate them, and it's taking me out of my comfort zone and things like that. So I think that is an issue as well with literature, again, where it's written by hearing authors as opposed to deaf authors.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to add a little bit, like a couple of things from listening to all of you. So this is something to remind the audience: is deafness and hearing loss is an invisible disability. So unless you can like see a hearing aid or cochlear implant, you're not gonna, know. Also, I know some deaf people who refuse to use their voice speak, even though they can, because if you do, people forget, if you speak well, that you can't hear well. So I was thinking Mondo mentioned someone suggesting to them, why don't you get the audio back? Well, because I can't hear it. You could probably hear it, but all you're going to hear is blah, 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 blah. So, yeah. I feel like you've already answered question number 3, which was how important is it for authors to be deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind themselves to write authentically about the deaf, hard of hearing, deaf-blind experience? You've already answered that, and I love that. So we're going to go to number 4. Do you believe that literature can help advocate for deaf rights or create social change?
I want to say absolutely. Absolutely, because like I said, that book I read when I was younger, deaf like me, it allowed me to understand, the scope of what society already knew and what society already thought about me. And as I got older and I was able to learn more about deaf community and deaf experience, it made me angry. It made me very angry to realize how much has been kept from us, like, how much language has been kept from us. Like, I'm like looking in this, just in this room, we're all having this panel discussion and all of us are voicing because it's easier for us because unfortunately we are Alexander Graham Bell's wildest dream. Like, we've been put into a position where we actively are having to choose to voice instead of to speak with sign because we've been mainstreamed. We've been peer pressured by so many people, by our doctors, by our parents, by our siblings, our family members, our friends, our teachers, our doctors, so on and so forth. The list goes on, specifically to be less deaf. They want us to cosplay as hearing, and that's not possible. And so being able to read all of these different books about deaf experience, like this book by Shalaman, for instance, you were talking about how like deafness is very much for a lot of people an almost invisible disability. And Shalaman actually came out with these artistic earpieces. I'm actually wearing one right now. It was a gift. But you can see how like this metal around my hearing aid. And the purpose was to make my disability more visible. It's bright purple, like at the school, it's like peace on there that I wore specifically for today. I don't want to lose it. But I find that I would not have known about something like this and about the fact that people out there want to be visible, that they are not shamed, that they don't have to hide. Because for so much of my life, I thought I had to hide my disability. I was going into my job interviews, and I'm not telling them that I can't hear until the end of the interview after they offer me the job. Turned out they assumed I was British or something because of my voice instead of deafness. So they're like, yeah, and then they find out that I'm deaf, and they're like, oh, wait, shoot, now we can't like withdraw the offer because now that's illegal. But being able to see these different representations allows me to pursue visibility. It allows me to pursue and advocate for deaf rights. Because, like, for example, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a drag king. That's very visible. I'm one of, I want to say, I know of 5 other deaf drag kings in the United States. Or actually, no, I think possibly worldwide, actually. And that's something that's a very visible position. And that's not something that I would have necessarily learned about if it wasn't for representation by organizations like Deaf Queer Resource Center, as put together by Diego Renteria, who is also a librarian. And this social change happens because we are able to have a voice. Silent, written, spoken, we are able to put out our own experiences. We are able to create this representation ourselves because we have to. We have to. That is how we get the social change, because I've already found that it's very clear that people are not literally or figuratively going to listen to us unless we make a loud ruckus. We have to make a very loud ruckus. A lot of people have never heard a deaf person scream. Like, we are very, very, very loud when we want to be. We are very outspoken when we want to be. I see deaf people all over the place advocating for the fact that a lot of hearing people are trying to actively take up space in our communities without actually becoming a part of the community, without actually understanding our needs as a community. They want to put forth sign language as a means to an end in regards to clout, in regards to elevation, without actually considering, like, hey, there's people doing this work already. Why not elevate them? And so, like, literature has been a very driving force for my anger. for my social change because I'm reading all of these different stories by other people who have similar lived experience, and it makes me angry because we shouldn't necessarily have to come to a panel in order to be in community and be able to discuss these things and be able to have a spotlight shown on this. So that's why I really appreciate San Jose for having done this, like Deaf History Symposium. And so it's very much a driver for social change, even if it's just letting us know that it's possible in the first place.
I think also something that representation in literature helps bring to the attention of hearing people is how much this world and the environment around us is not built for us. It's not accessible. And I think reading about those experiences helps to turn a light bulb on for many people, because it's just something you don't realize how much depends on being able to hear to navigate the environment. And so like, when I try to explain that to people, a common example I use is the fact that I pre-board when I fly, because I can't understand boarding announcements. I hear them, but it's just gibberish to me. And so I always go up to the desk, I let them know I need to pre-board, and I ask for somebody to just let me know when it's time for me to board. And this one time, I think I was maybe 20 when it happened, I went up and I let them know. And they said, yeah, absolutely, they would let me know. And it was 25 minutes later, it was time to pre-board. And I hear them calling my name over the loudspeaker. And it's just, they just don't think. They don't think because they don't understand how much of the most mundane tasks depend on being able to hear. So I think that's something that representation in literature helps to enlighten people. And hopefully, optimistically, that can help to drive social change.
I would say, I would hope that literature has a deep impact on society. It is my personal dream that someday in the future, and at this point, I would like for Mondo to be the spearhead of this. But, you know, high schools have required reading. You have to read Maya Angelou. You have to read Cisneros. And so we know about people of different color and different cultures because of literature. And so I would love to see Mondo Vaden as a double hitter required LGBTQIA plus literature and deaf literature. Because you can't, protesting is great, sending out letters is great, calling your congressman if you have TTY is great, but you can't change hearts and minds if people don't know who is the mind that is being changed. And, you know, deaf experience, just the same as any other experience, needs to be expressed through and by the person. Several years ago, I remember reading Memoirs of a Geisha, and it was a fascinating read. I enjoyed it. And then I realized, looking at the cover, it's this very English male name. I was like, oh my God, I did not just do this. So, but it's really hard to look at someone and say, ooh, they're deaf, unless there's something hanging off of our ears. And so I always get I forget that you're deaf. And that drives me crazy because deafness is one of the few disabilities where we are expected to accommodate, which we're doing today too. I'm speaking because it's easier. I know the audience. Most of you are hearing people. And so I am accommodating you. But there's only so much accommodation I can do. Several years ago, the workplace that I was at, we were going to have a safety drill. So they decided to do a tornado run. And I was sitting at my desk and I was typing away, and I felt this like rumble go past my desk, and I was like, oh, someone must have brought cookies, because I feel that same rumble when someone has cookies. No, it was the tornado drill. And then they came back up and they're like, oh my God, we almost blew KayCee away, literally. And yeah, it was funny, but it was also extremely hurtful to know that because of my limitations that I cannot improve upon any further, I was excluded from even safety. So anyways, long way of saying, literature, I think, is a huge step in making sure people get to know different cultures, different attitudes, different ideas.
I wanted to say that, of course, it does advocate for deaf rights and create social change just because of the fact. Look at why, I mean, there's a lot of people banning books right now, and some of those books are actually about representing the disabled community as a whole, and a lot of those books being targeted are about those with disabilities, especially those of people of color. And so it definitely does. And I completely lost my train of thought. But anyway, but I think the thing with like, you know, like with banning books and stuff, it's like we're becoming more visible and they just want to believe their own, you know, stereotypical beliefs about the deaf experience, because then it makes us more visible and it makes our, it means that they cannot ignore the different ways in which society basically fails us and does not accommodate us. And so I think that's one of the reasons, again, why they're targeting the different books, is because they want to keep us invisible for that reason. And so, so I would say, of course it does, but we definitely need to have more representation that is, again, by deaf, hard of hearing authors, and from our perspectives, not somebody trying to project their ideas of what it's like on it, you know. And so, so yeah. Thank you.
So I'd like to get to the two questions, and then hopefully I can add that very last question to the panel. So the first question was thoughts on deaf literature and audiobooks for public library. And so that was kind of already answered. I mean, I think it's good to have audiobooks, but obviously they're not exactly, you know, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind people are not going to be able to use them. But it's just another way to help with advocating for deaf rights and social change and getting more hearing people like reading, engaging with these books. Then I'm all for it. And Braille, yeah, definitely. So the second question is, what deaf informed processes should MLIS program teach us students about how to give joy signs for deaf kids under 5 or other age ranges? So I had to laugh because KayCee and I did a presentation that touched on this topic. And I'm going to give you the very short answer. If you are not deaf or hard of hearing, then you shouldn't be doing that on your own. You really need to get somebody from the deaf community who is fluent in ASL, knows how to do ASL storytelling, like if you want to pair up with someone, fine, or have someone do it at your library, fine. But having a hearing ASL teacher or a hearing librarian or hearing coder, no. That's the short answer. So if anyone disagrees with me, feel free to chime in. So we have 6 minutes left. Mondo?
Yes, I want to say I agree with you strongly. This is something I had personally experienced where people were talking about having a hearing librarian with a hearing ASL interpreter giving a story time. Literally, like, and this was when I was physically working there. They asked me to consult on that, but they did not want me to participate in that because they did not want to promote me to librarian. Long story. But basically, like, there's a lot of deaf people in your communities who are very capable of doing a deaf story time. Like, I have friends who do this where they themselves have children. Deaf people are parents too. Deaf people are able to read stories to their children all the time. And that should be something that should be done in libraries. That should be replicated in libraries where you work with your community. You find out, okay, where's my deaf community? Reach out to those networks. Find out if they have someone who would like to volunteer or like be paid for their services to run one of these ASL story times. Because right now, most of what we have for children about is things like this, where it's specifically geared for hearing children to learn sign language, specifically so they can like tell their hearing parents what they can, like what they want, are they hungry or whatever, and then after a certain point, they stop learning because they view this as specific hearing accommodation. And so I told them specifically, do you want this story time to be for hearing children, or are you trying to bring deaf community into the library? And you have to ask yourself that and be very honest with yourself. And like I said, if you don't listen to what Evelyn just suggested, then you're probably not doing it how it should be done.
I also want to add into that just real quick that if you're going to start doing programs around deaf history, deaf culture, deaf story times, then you need to plan for longevity with them. You can't just do it as a one-off and say, oh, that's great. That's something that we checked off the calendar. Like maybe staffing situations, I understand, but if you're going to bring in the deaf person to your library, you should at least be able to give them a monthly slot or something like that. Because when I worked at my previous libraries, I did deaf programs pretty frequently. And I go back now and I look at their calendar and it's like they never existed at all. And it's just personally very frustrating to me to be somebody who says, okay, we need this, I'm going to do this. And it just stops after I leave. That's not cool.
Culturally, I think it's the same as like, if you suddenly decided to have a Swedish story time, are you going to have the librarian flipping through a Swedish English dictionary really fast and then doing it, or have an actual Swedish person doing the story time?
I would add to that, again, this is from my experience, thinking back as when, I was first diagnosed with hearing loss. It would have been great to have had a library have an ASL story time, but it's one of those things where, again, it has to be someone who is deaf, hard of hearing, because as a child growing up, I did not have that representation of, any interaction with the deaf community. And that is very important for us, for deaf children to have deaf adult role models, and to see that representation and to see what it is that we're capable of, because it builds self-confidence in us. It makes it easier for us to advocate for ourselves, seeing someone in the deaf community, seeing what they're able to achieve and accomplish, and and being able to communicate with each other. Again, like, I know that KayCee is fluent in ASL, but I'm not. And it's one of those things where you have deaf people who never learned ASL because we were mainstreamed. We were told, we need to focus on speech and lip reading and not on sign language. Somehow us learning sign language is made to be out to be a bad thing, because doctors tell the parents that if they learn sign language, this will impede their ability to speak and learn English, which is not true. And so because of that, deaf people cannot communicate with each other. Those who are fluent in ASL grew up in the deaf community, and those who did not. So we're having to use English, which is not, trying to speak or, use the limited sign language that some of us trying to communicate with each other. And I think that's something that libraries should keep in mind, is that, again, I think it should be tailored for the deaf community, especially in places like rural communities where, again, you do not know each other. You do not know that the other person exists, because there's like no built-in community, oddly enough, in those communities. And so, again, just keep that in mind. Like Evelyn said, it has to be deaf, hard of hearing person teaching or doing the ASL story times.
So unfortunately, we are at 2:01. So I definitely don't want to hold up people, even though we had like another question in the chat. And I was more curious. So the panelists, we had one final question. If you wanted to send me your responses by email, I would love to hear it. Like, I'm hoping to finally finish 2 writing projects by the end of this year.
If I may have one.
It's a middle grade kids book, and one is a play. So, and both have depth representation in them. So they always said, if you want to find the book that you want to read and it's not out there, then write it yourself. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Evelyn, if you don't mind, when you're done, I'd like to just say a closing, and I would be happy to speak to that question as well, if people have the time. But yeah. Okay. Well, again, I want to thank everyone here. So again, let's give them a loud Zoom thank you for all of their work and sharing their time, experience, and wisdom with us. I always appreciate the clarity and the vulnerability of, sharing experiences. And because we're recording it, because we're going to transcribe it, this will be part of a growing record for this particular symposium. So thank you for your contributions to that. I also want to reaffirm my sincerest apologies to Mondo for using the wrong pronoun for him. I'm terribly sorry for that misstep. I have a daughter who's non-binary, and I certainly should know better. So my apologies. Also want to do special thanks to our entire iSchool team. And this will actually lead to the question that Q asked, because we have a big team that put together this event, including our Culture and Community Student Assistants, Masuko Friedland and Nicole Azoff, who had worked with all of you and the panelists. Our Tech Student Assistant, Claire Aciola. Thank you for saving us, Claire, who's providing tech support. Our Events Coordinator, Vivian Zuo. and our Communications and Marketing Director, Nicole Purviance. Thanks for all of your work. Also, special thanks to our interpreters, Dane and Aviva, for your excellent work as well. To access all of our previous Culture and Community Symposia for the past 4 years, let me put the links in the chat. So we do 9 National Heritage Months, and so we have recordings and 4 years worth of incredible leadership and comments in all of those areas. We also have a YouTube channel. So please go to all of those if you're interested. Our next symposium will be Wednesday, May 14th from 10 to noon to celebrate NHPI Heritage Month, focusing on South Asians. And then in June, we'll be celebrating LGBTQ plus Pride Month, and also Juneteenth Day with in partnership with the California Librarian Black Caucus. So as we close today's event, I invite all of us to carry forward what we've heard, the lessons we've learned, the wisdom, not just in thought, but in action. Whether you're a librarian, educator, student, or advocate, you have the power to shape more inclusive spaces and stories. There will be missteps along the way, but of course, it is worth pursuing all of that. So thank you for being part of this journey and for helping us build a future for everyone's voice so that they are seen, heard, and valued. So again, thank you for your time. With that being said, there's a very important question that was asked. So I did want to touch on that if that's okay with everyone. Obviously, you feel free to drop off if you have a conflict. I'm actually late for another meeting, but the question is an important one. And it's a question that we also get oftentimes in other Heritage Month celebrations in terms of making sure that we build it into our workflow, our day-to-day, and not just celebrate it once a year. And so that is a very important question. I actually tried to hire Mondo before, but for financial reasons, we were not able to do that. But Mondo, if you're willing, I might try it again if we have the resources to do that. So my response to Q is that, yes, we do need to build it into our day-to-day. So the iSchool at San Jose State, we're renowned for our forward thinking in many different areas, including technology. We have 2 Gen AI robots. We're pushing in the XR world. And without a doubt, the deaf and hard of hearing are not being included consciously in those efforts, not because of an attempt to exclude. However, it's just because we're figuring it out in that space, right? But with that being said, it is critical, absolutely, to make sure we have someone like Mondo or others who are there to remind us that we must, be purposeful and strategic to ensure that we're inclusive in our work. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let the panel respond to that question as well. But I want you to know that we are certainly willing to continue to be better in this space, right? But it takes a lot of time and resources. And of course, there are many other communities that also want the exact same thing. And so we are definitely trying to do this work in all areas. So let me hand it over back to Evelyn. Evelyn, do you want you and the panel to answer that question as well?
If you guys want to answer the question, we have a little bit of time. If not, I don't know if you want to answer the last question. My last question for you was, what would you like to see published in the future that includes authentic deaf representation? So if you could just give me like one idea or one like book idea or whatever, I'd like to hear what would you like to see?
I'd like to speak to the question about what institutions can do to help accommodate and gaps in coverage. My experiences are colored by the fact that I went through library school during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so one of the things that highlighted for me was everybody was masking, and I'm heavily dependent on lip reading to understand. I was excluded from almost everything. My teachers were able to make academic accommodations, but there was a total lack of social accommodations, I want to say. And often I feel like academic accommodations are all that's really focused on. But there's so many other ways that we can serve deaf students, students with disabilities, is by making everything else more accessible as well and thinking about how we can serve them.
As for
me? Okay. I'm getting confused as to who's supposed to speak. I wanted to kind of answer both questions in a way. The one about how to improve the accommodations process is pretty simple. Is basically just include us in the discussion from the very beginning. It's just, as the saying goes, nothing about us without us. So that's the most important thing in any presentation I've ever given about, what it's about deaf programming or services and things like that in libraries, is always include the community within the decision process from the very beginning for planning, assessment, anything. So that's for that question. And then the other question about what we like to see in the future in publications about deaf representation. For me, a lot of the books that are out, they have a very kind of strict representation of this person, deaf person. They know ASL, or this deaf person does not know, or, it's either or kind of thing. And it's basically, we all have a diversity of experiences. And one thing that for me, as someone who has more than one disability, I would love to see representation of a deaf person who is also autistic, ADHD, has depression, has generalized anxiety disorder, has, all of these other health issues, because a lot of us, like in any kind of disability, a community that I've been involved in, we basically start listing a long list of disabilities that we have, in ways in which we are, impacted. And it's not just one thing. So I would love to see characters that have, that encompass all of that about ourselves. And yes, the autistic, ADHD, deafy. Yes. But yeah, that's that. Yeah. So that's my, that's what I would love to see in publications. So.
So to answer the first question about just academic accommodations, I think people covered largely what I would say, but I would also add that what matters to me with accommodation is that the person who's doing the accommodation needs to act like it's not out of the normal for them. Like, this is just something that we're adding into the conversation. It always kind of drove me nuts whenever my teachers would make a big deal about putting on the microphone in school and testing it and making sure that I could hear them. I was like, you do this like every other day now. Can we just move on? And like, this is part of your routine. So that's kind of the thing that I really say. It's like, add it, but don't go out of your way to highlight it or talk about how unique you are for adding it. And then with deaf representation in literature, what I'd like to see is more genre fiction. I feel like, you see there's like one romance with a deaf character, one mystery with a deaf character. I want to be able to do a really specific book display with all mysteries by deaf authors or deaf characters. Like, I would love to just be able to put 10 books in that display.
Yes, for me, one takeaway would be that it's not just a month, Deaf History Month or appreciation, what have you. I am deaf 12 months out of the year, and so are most of my cohorts. Never heard of seasonal deafness. So when you have accommodations, you also need to publicize the accommodations, because a lot of us are sitting back in the background. I've seen invitations on Facebook, Instagram, and more of them are saying wheelchair accessible, cart transcription available. And so, because when I look at these things, I'm sitting going, well, if I can't be a part of it, I'm not going to go. But when I see, oh my, there's going to be an interpreter there, well, I will be there right now. So there's a lot of people who sit back for whatever reason going, am I going to be able to be a part of this equally with everyone? Or am I just going to be sitting in the back laughing when I think it's appropriate and hoping I haven't laughed at something ridiculous like eugenics, hurrah, rah, rah. And then on a personal note, I would love a science fiction novel about a deaf queer person championing the cosmos and space, because, you know, space is quiet, so we hear. Pardon the pun. And I would love an actual horror movie that is not like the horror movie Hush. That was a horrible representation. I will give them one little pass in that they did make that deaf character a rather late deafened, but seriously, if someone's being murdered outside my window, I'm going to see it out the corner of my eye. That's all I got to say.
I just want to jump in and add one more thing. I think that's something else that institutions can do is just build accessibility and from the get-go, because it's exhausting requesting accommodations. It never ends. You know, we constantly have to advocate for ourselves and think about, you know, what barriers exist sorry, my lights go out. Okay, I'm going to talk in the dark. What barriers exist at this thing that I want to go to? Is it worth requesting the accommodations? Is it worth, you know, all this extra work that I'm going to have to do? So many accommodations are easy to just build them into it. You know, it's all a part of inclusivity, is that right now it just doesn't exist. Like, all the emotional labor is on us.
So I just wanted to say several things. One, I just exchanged emails with Mondo to rekindle our conversation, and several things. If you're interested, I would encourage you to put your email address in the chat. And the reason why is because this recording, what we found is the recordings, of course, are viewed you know, much more than the real-time attendance. And so and the reason why I'm encouraging you to put your email address is because I think there's, of course, a lot of consulting opportunities, right? And I want to talk to Mondo about that. And maybe this group, maybe the iSchool creates a consulting group where people that want to do, Katie, what you just said, can hire you. And so anyway, I'm encouraged by this. Obviously, the symposium is also a networking opportunity for all of us, right? To really think about how we can best support the deaf and hard of hearing. And so yeah, again, I thank all of you for your time. You do have our contact information. I am going to talk to Mondo, and maybe we can, again, maybe create some kind of consulting group and leverage the iSchool's resources in our web presence to make you available to everyone else, right? And so anyway, and it's all because of you. it's because of this symposium, that you're impacting myself. And so I want to take action. And let's, anyway, just thinking out loud. I'll talk to you guys about it offline. But maybe, Mondo, that's something that we can talk about, right? Maybe some of the members here, maybe we can organize you all as a consulting group or something like that. Because I know a lot of other people feel the same way, that obviously we want to do better, but we're so busy. We're so tired, and resources is always an issue. But with that being said, 100% Katie and all of you, especially as we're pushing into robotics and AI and all that stuff, right, that we have to make sure that the deaf and hard of hearing are represented from the very beginning, not an afterthought. So, yeah. But anyway, again, thank you so much. Any final thoughts? Great. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Again, this will be recorded, and everyone have a wonderful day.